With this ring, I the web. Oh, hi! You got me looking at a ridiculous wedding from Spider-Man comics. Hey, speaking of weddings in Spider-Man comics, let's talk about the wedding in Spider-Man comics. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. I know this looks slightly different than usual. My house has gone through a flood, so bear with me. I've had to reorganize some things. Today, let's talk about some Spider-Man lore. 1987, Marvel Comics had a story where Spider-Man got married. Maybe it's more accurate to say that his alter ego, Peter Parker, finally got married after 25 years of him dating various characters. And then, Peter was married to Mary Jane for the next 20 years of stories, until Marvel decided to undo it in the unfortunate storyline, One More Day. But I've already talked about that. A lot of people have talked about that infamous story. Instead, today, I want to talk about how the marriage itself was actually pretty rushed behind the scenes. It was chaos. I think it ultimately led to some great stories where Peter had one great happy thing in his otherwise very dramatic life. But the wedding itself, thanks to trying to coordinate the daily comic strip by Stan Lee with the monthly comic books, it was, in a word, chaos. So, please hit like and subscribe, share stuff, watch the credits while I talk about what happened to my house. But for now, let's talk about the Spider-Man wedding. The inception of marrying off Spider-Man happened in July of 1986. According to both Jim Shooter, then the editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics, and Stan Lee, Spider-Man's co-creator, the two men were featured on a question-and-answer panel at the Chicago Comic-Con in July. A fan asked if Peter Parker would ever get married, and Stan said it would be up to Jim, and then Jim said he'd do whatever Stan wanted to do. Jim wrote on his blog in 2011 about the convention attendees buzzing about that news, writing, quote, "Later, Stan and I talked about it. He thought having Spider-Man get married would be a great thing for the newspaper strip. We agreed that it was important to coordinate the comics and the strip so that the event would take place in the same week of the same month and in the same way as much as possible. Well, we blew that all to hell." The challenge was coordinating the two very different timelines of the newspaper strip and the comic book. Stan wanted to have it happen the following summer, so it was going to happen the following summer. But while that was plenty of time to set things up in the daily newspaper strip, Marvel had to quickly rearrange plans because that meant that they had less than 12 issues of Amazing Spider-Man to work on to make sure that it made sense. Because, spoiler, Peter Parker was still kind of in a relationship with Black Cat, aka Felicia Hardy, at that point in time. Let's take a high-level look at who Peter Parker had dated in the comics real quick. From issue 11 through 23 of Amazing Spider-Man, Peter dated Betty Brant from the Daily Bugle. It was his first real relationship, and it was pretty short-lived. His first serious relationship is with Gwen Stacy, who he meets at college, and they date from issue 53 through 121, where the Green Goblin kills her. That was a really good chunk of time. Peter's Aunt May introduces Peter to her friend's daughter, Mary Jane, and they eventually date from issues 143 through 182. Not quite 2 years. After that, they break up, but she remains a supporting character. Spider-Man begins dating Black Cat about the same amount of time. They hit relationship problems because Black Cat is more interested in Spider-Man than Peter, but they continue to have chemistry and on and off again relationship. They wonder if they should get back together. In fact, there's still some romantic tension between them in issue 289 of Amazing Spider-Man before he proposes to Mary Jane in the following issue. Oh, and Mary Jane actually says no at that point in time. But put a pin in all of that because we'll loop back in more detail. Marvel wanted to pace it out so that they could feature a wedding in issue 300 of Amazing Spider-Man, but that wouldn't come out until January of 1988, about 6 months after the comic strip's planned wedding. Jim Shooter said he felt it was important to get the story to match somewhat, so the story got bumped forward in the comics, and they published it in a special annual issue of Amazing Spider-Man, number 21, that came out in July. Still not quite when the comic strip did their version. Amazing Spider-Man's editor, Jim Salicrup, explained his perspective to Back Issue magazine in 2007, saying, quote, "I was hoping we'd have at least a year or so to build up to it, but I was wrong. I should have known. Stan is the most impatient guy in the world, so if he was asking, it was because it was going to be his next storyline." As soon as Jim Shooter and Stan Lee decided to make the marriage happen, Marvel's PR department got involved. Marvel's promotion director, Steve Saffel, came up with the idea to have Willie Smith, a famous fashion designer, create Mary Jane's iconic wedding dress. The PR department also decided to have a high-profile real-life event booked for June 5th at Mets Stadium. I do appreciate that Marvel had it take place at Shea Stadium, since Peter Parker is canonically a Mets fan, not a Yankees fan. They had a model play Mary Jane and a mystery man dressed as Spider-Man, and Stan Lee himself officiated the ceremony before about 45,000 people that were there for the game. Jim Shooter says they actually printed a free copy of the wedding issue for everyone in attendance, but that because it was free, he saw the comics overflowing from the trash cans throughout the stadium, or ripped apart to make paper airplanes, or just left on the floor under the seat covered in spilled beer. Nevertheless, the wedding got mentioned on the news all over the place, so it was a net win for Marvel. Shooter says he didn't care by that point though, because Marvel had let him go back in April, and while he started the ball rolling on the comic and helped write a draft of the comic annual, he only went to the event because the publicity team had invited him. This was a major event for Marvel, and they had just let their editor-in-chief go just before finishing it. New owners had purchased Marvel in January of 1987, and they wanted new management. The behind-the-scenes turmoil probably helps explain why the comic book didn't get coordinated to happen closer to the comic strip version. But speaking of the comic strip, Stan Lee wrote that from 1977 through 2019, although in more recent years, it's come out that while Stan was credited, he actually had Roy Thomas as a ghostwriter for most of the comic, and he would pay him maybe a third of what Stan was getting paid. Crazy stuff. He got paid a page rate, and Stan got a big salary. I want to talk a little bit about the newspaper strip real quick. We're going to take a small detour because the comic strip is insane, way crazier than the comic book. The comic strip basically had its own continuity, and it moved very slowly. Most of the daily 3-panel strips would dedicate one panel to recapping what was happening and use the last one as a cliffhanger. So it moved at a snail's pace. Here's an example of how dull things could be. This is a comic strip where Aunt May actually agrees to marry the Mole Man, and it's so boring that Spider-Man literally forgets what's going on in 2 separate days worth of comic strips. And Spider-Man wasn't as impressive. He was often banging into a wall or getting hit on the head with random objects that his spider sense failed to warn him about. And every once in a while, Stan, or whoever was writing it, would use other Marvel characters, but in strange ways. My favorite? The several months-long storyline where Peter's boss, J. Jonah Jameson, takes time out of running a newspaper to fly around in Iron Man's armor, with his face projecting through the faceplate somehow. Fans call this the Iron Jonah arc. Jonah challenges Spider-Man to debate him on TV. That causes his much more grounded editor-in-chief Robbie Robertson to quit in protest. Then, Jonah gives Tony Stark a huge donation, and in exchange, Tony lends Jonah the use of his original suit, which can now be operated as a robot. Jonah has a tech guy fly it around to bring out Spider-Man and fight him. Spider-Man makes the robot Iron Man crash into a van, which happened to be where the tech guy was working. From there, Jonah forces the tech guy to help Jonah put on the suit, and he flies around town calling himself Iron Jonah with his face on the mask, making him kind of look like a robot Hitler. He stops some thugs that break into an empty National Guard base that's in the middle of Manhattan. The thugs drive a fully fueled up tank out onto the street, but Jonah in the Iron Man armor stops it. And then the storyline just kind of fizzles out because Jonah is happy that it got him on TV. Yeah, like I said, the comic strip was crazy, but on June 21st, the wedding took place in the comic strip. It's actually a pretty straightforward story. There's no villains that interrupt it, although at one point, Peter's walking down the street and bumps into an angry wrestler named Hugo the Hippo, but that doesn't take long. The wedding itself takes place at the home of Mary Jane's uncle, who officiates the ceremony for them. There's one brief moment where Spider-Man thinks he's going to have to save a construction guy from falling, but the police handle it, and the wedding goes off without a hitch. It's a cute story, and they were married in the comic strip until 2007, when the comic book undid their marriage, and the comic strip followed suit. But the comic strip doesn't include the same supernatural story where Mephisto magically undoes things. It just has text for several days explaining that it didn't happen. However, fans did not like this, and Stan Lee, always a people pleaser, undid it in 2009. He just has Peter wake up with Mary Jane and says that the last 2 years of strips were a bad dream. The comic books to this day still have the marriage undone and forgotten about, but the comic strip actually reversed things. So the Shea Stadium event kind of underwhelmed, with fans tossing the comic away, and the comic strip just sort of did whatever it wanted. It happened. How did things go down in the comic book? Not badly. But Jim Shooter told writer David Michelinie to simplify the continuity so that new readers could understand things. And that led to some interesting decisions. I've mentioned how there was still some simmering romantic tension with Black Cat, and really, that relationship had run its course, but was mostly the focus of the second title, Spectacular Spider-Man. Her apartment had recently been destroyed, and she'd actually moved in with Peter. But ultimately, that was kind of a scam on her part. Still, if you were only reading Amazing Spider-Man, you saw him sharing a home with Felicia Hardy in issue 289, and then suddenly proposing to Mary Jane in 290. It was jarring if you only read one title. In 2017, European licensee Panini reprinted the wedding issue, and writer David Michelinie wrote an introduction for it, along with explaining he was resistant to getting Peter married because he felt it made him appear older. He shared how he first pitched a story where Peter is talking to long-dead characters Gwen Stacy and his Uncle Ben about whether he should get married, and he's ultimately having a hallucination because he got hit in the head by a supervillain. Jim Shooter said to simplify it for new readers, and wrote the plot himself, with Michelinie writing the dialogue. And Michelinie wasn't the only Marvel artist or writer resistant to the marriage. Here are some quotes from Back Issue Magazine, issue 23, that asked what other artists thought at the time. Former Spider-Man writer and one-time Marvel editor-in-chief Marv Wolfman said, quote, "I never thought Spidey and MJ getting married was a good idea. But I also always thought the Spidey newspaper strip was a very different entity from the comic and had to appeal to a very different audience, where that kind of soap opera was fine." Jerry Conway was another former writer, and he stated, "If I'd had input, I would have argued against it." Eric Larson drew the title Once Peter and Mary Jane Were Married and said, "The marriage in the comics was pretty abrupt, because at the time, the two hadn't even been dating, and MJ had previously refused Peter's proposal some years earlier. Their reconciliation and following nuptials came out of left field." Ron Frenz was one of the artists of this era and said, quote, "I didn't like it either. I had a lot of the same concerns that fandom in general seemed to have in response to that whole every man being married to a supermodel thing." And finally, John Romita Sr. drew the covers, and he said, quote, "I merely reminded everyone of Lil Abner and Daisy May getting married, and how, soon after, the strip seemed to wane. But as usual, my business thoughts were ignored, and it was a huge PR success." To To make it more reader-friendly, they put Spider-Man in his more recognizable red and blue suit on the cover for the newsstand version, and as Peter Parker for the direct edition to comic shops, making it Marvel's first variant cover. Both were illustrated by Spider-Man legend John Romita Sr. Inside the story, Peter is sometimes still wearing his black and white suit. Another quirk about Annual number 21 is that it shows us both Peter's and Mary Jane's last-minute nerves as they had just agreed to get married, with a reproposal and the wedding all taking place in the same issue. It happens fairly quickly. But while Peter talks to the regular supporting cast about it, they didn't have Mary Jane talk to anyone important. And that was strange, because the monthly title had just had Mary Jane reconnect with her estranged sister, and she has her uncle officiate the ceremony. But the book doesn't give us any time with those characters having a new conversation. Not bad at all, but weird for the regular readers to see something that Mary Jane's sister Gail, who was just in the June issue of Amazing Spider-Man, not even get mentioned or show up to the wedding the following month. It's a big contrast because there are pages upon pages of Peter being concerned about getting married, but Mary Jane doesn't even get one scene with, say, her beloved Aunt Anna. Instead, Mary Jane's nerves are represented with a weird subplot. She has a never-before-seen boyfriend try to whisk her away to Paris. This tall, rich playboy shows up in a Ferrari, and his face is in shadows. His name is Bruce. It is strongly implied that this is Bruce Wayne, aka Batman, from DC Comics. Huh? Is Marvel trying to imply Batman wants to break up a happy relationship? Or maybe he's just ready to settle down? What were they thinking? Peter has a bad dream that features some of his allies and enemies attending the wedding. I've always loved the deadpan delivery by Hobgoblin telling him to die. But ultimately, Peter gets past his worries and faces them head-on, allowing himself to be happy, and the couple get married. Interestingly, they do so at City Hall, which Jim Shooter says is where Stan Lee wanted it to happen, but that Stan either forgot or changed his mind last minute, so in the comic strip, it just happens at Uncle Spencer's house. It's a nice story, if not groundbreaking. It did its job of being reader-friendly as a good jumping-on point. It is interesting that the artist that Marvel got was Paul Ryan. I'd call him a very good artist, and personally, I really liked his Fantastic Four run. I just would have thought that for a single big story like this, Marvel would have tried to get one of their bigger names at the time, like John Romita Jr. or Mike Zeck. Perhaps they were stretched thin and felt the story itself sold readers and didn't warrant paying for a bigger name artist. The marriage went on to last for about 20 years, with no big scandals. It got adapted into the animated series for the final season. It got set up as a plot point in the background of the third live-action movie. And it's proved so popular that Marvel has revisited the idea of Peter as a happily married father in multiverse stories like Spider-Girl, Renew Your Vows, and, most recently, a 2-year run of Ultimate Spider-Man by Jonathan Hickman and Marco Cicchetto. Marriage isn't the most common thing for superheroes. The first ones for popular characters with their own titles were really in the 1960s, as superheroes became a bit more serious in the Silver Age of comics. Aquaman, Flash, the Fantastic Four. The only significant one I can think of from the 70s is Vision and Scarlet Witch. Spider-Man was a bit of an anomaly in the mid-80s, along with Hawkeye and Mockingbird. There were a few more in the 90s, like Superman and Lois Lane, and Cyclops and Jean Grey, but only about half of what I just listed have actually lasted. It's funny to look back at the Wedding Annual and realize how much chaos was going on behind the scenes. Not just trying to coordinate the story with a newspaper strip, but the fact that Marvel's owners were brand new and that they wanted to make all sorts of changes behind the scenes. In a way, I'm impressed with how it came out and that it wasn't a weird mess with a ton of guest villains jammed in. And in the years that have followed, writers gave Peter a happy marriage. It may have occurred quickly as an actual wedding, but once it did, the marriage was treated very respectfully. Peter Parker is always having bad luck with money and health and family, to say nothing of his battles as Spider-Man. So he got to marry a supermodel. I think writers protected that idea of being married happily, because then Peter's life isn't pure trauma. Many Marvel editors and writers have been concerned that being married somehow makes Peter Parker look older than they'd like. But I would argue that living a life of pure misery is way more unrelatable than having a normal relationship. Chaotic or not, I loved Peter and Mary Jane, and I hope one day Marvel gets them back together. Thank you everybody for watching. I've had to rearrange my setup here because my basement flooded. If you didn't watch last episode, I talk about that over the closing credits. My basement level flooded. It's half of my house. So what I was able to sort of salvage and save for comic books, I've sort of had to, in the short term, move upstairs, like these short boxes of what survived. I lost about maybe 25% of my comics, along with a lot of other stuff. That's life. But I do have a GoFundMe. Insurance is capping my coverage at $10,000, and my wife and I have begun a lot of the work, and we've got our final estimates. We're looking at least $80,000 in repairs. So we're asking for help from my family, friends, and community for about half of that, just so that we're not financially ruined. But if you're not in a position, please, no pressure. It's more the idea of a lot of small donations can help get us to a position where we're in better financial shape ourselves. And I'm sorry that I have to ask for that. I really wish I had a better solution. One thing I'm going to do to try to be productive is I am going to sit in and co-host with Comic Tom on one of his Whatnot claim sales on April 24th, Friday. So we will have some original art, variant covers, interesting keys. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be something new to me. Comic Tom has reached out. He's local to me. So we're going to do a claim sale together, which should be a lot of fun. And donating a portion to my wife and I recovery. So this could be an opportunity for you to get something cool, and you'd be helping us a lot along the way. So bookmark that. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back real soon with more episodes. Keep reading comics. Bye.